Let's stay with sanctions on Cuba. In late October this year, 189 member states of the United Nations renewed their long-standing call for the United States to lift the economic blockade on the island country. Now, the General Assembly has voted annually on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed on Cuba for almost 60 years. SABC Correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease last night joined SABC News for an interview from New York on the issues relating to the General Assembly vote on Cuba. Watch.
While action is taken by the General Assembly here in New York, this Cuban economic blockade is domesticated law in the United States. So despite the era of détente under the Obama administration, when diplomatic relations were re-established between the island and the mainland of the United States, the Obama administration was unable to lift the embargo because it needs to be done through an act of Congress. And you'll remember, Lulu, 2 years into President Obama's term in office, they lost both houses, both the House of Representatives and the Senate to Republicans. And with those two chambers under Republican control, so much harder did the Obama administration's desire to see that embargo lifted fall away. And so what we see in the General Assembly annually is a very animated debate. And among those speaking in this year's debate was South Africa's Ambassador Jerry Machila. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The imposition of these unilateral coercive measures by a major economy such as the United States against a fellow developing country, one of its closest geographic neighbor, has caused immeasurable damage to the development of the people of Cuba and remains, as ever before, unjustified. Indeed, this was a fact that the United States itself recognized under the Obama administration as it began to pursue normalization of diplomatic relations and a gradual relaxation of embargo. Regrettably, this progressive step has since been reversed, and the people of Cuba are once again faced with monumental obstacles toward the fulfillment of their basic human rights, including the rights to development and realization of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. South Africa also remains deeply concerned by the extraterritorial application of the unilateral and illegal embargo of Cuba by the United States. This regressive policy prevents third countries from pursuing normal trade and investment opportunity with Cuba, further undermining our collective efforts towards sustainable development.
South Africa's ambassador there, Jerry Machila, certainly not mincing his words, Lulu, on this subject. And he refers there to the extraterritorial application of what is essentially a unilateral decision by the United States. And what he means by that is that through this economic embargo on Cuba, countries wanting to do trade, wanting to perhaps invest in Cuba, wanting to have business relations with Cuba, are then also affected by the breadth and scope of this embargo, given the interconnectedness that we see in the global financial system today. So you see similar issues, concerns raised by countries like South Africa, for example, because of punitive measures that the United States has imposed on countries like Iran. You'll remember there was a big dispute about South Africa buying Iranian oil. The United States imposing this unilateral decision on Cuba, but you can see how the tranches or the tentacles, if you will, of this economic blockade are affecting countries, sovereign states around the world as well.
Now, Sherwin, there was some momentum, as you mentioned earlier, under the administration of former President Barack Obama, who became the first American president in 2016 to visit the island since 1928. How have things changed under the Trump administration?
One of the first decisions taken under this the current administration was to reaffirm the strength of this embargo. One of the first decisions President Trump took was to sign a memo in a place called Little Havana in Florida. The Republican Party has a very strong ex-Cuban constituency in Florida, and you'll remember that Florida is a very important swing state, whether you're talking about midterm elections or whether you're talking about presidential elections. So that electoral constituency of the Cuban exiles in Florida have become a very vocal part of the Republican Party. One of the main senators, Marco Rubio in Florida, whose family is of Cuban descent, and so they immediately began lobbying this president, the Republican president at that, to reaffirm the embargo, and it seems very unlikely that under this White House, and certainly with Republicans in control of the Senate, the prospects of lifting this through rescinding domestic legislation seems less likely at this time.
Now, the United States has made the human rights situation in Cuba a core reason for their tightening of the embargo. How does that play at the United Nations?
Well, it doesn't really play very well here. One of the main tenets of the UN Charter, Lulu, is the sovereignty of member states. You become part of the UN family, but you retain your sovereignty. And one of the big issues at the United Nations is the interference in the internal affairs of a country. It's a big no-no. And you see this kind of battle between interference and trying to particularly influence the human rights situations in countries. Many countries here, including South Africa, feel that while there might be human rights concerns in Cuba, that this is a domestic issue. It should be handled domestically by the people of Cuba, and that through this embargo, the United States and an external player is trying to influence domestic politics in Cuba. And that, of course, is a big no-no in terms of the UN Charter and certainly the affirmation of the sovereignty of states.
Well, here's some good news.